Preface of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. Preface. When I began the study of the domestic slave trade of the Southern States, I had no idea of the conclusions as herein found. Especially is this true of chapters 3 and 4. I have spared no pains to be accurate in all statements of fact. The material for this work was collected in the Yale University Library in New Haven, Connecticut, and in the Congressional Library at Washington. The sources used are to be found in the appended bibliography. The most helpful were books of travel, newspapers and periodicals, statistics of Southern states, and the United States Census reports. W. H. Collins, Claremont College, Hickory, North Carolina, February 22, 1904. End of preface. Chapter 1 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. A sketch of the rise of the slave trade in African states and of the foreign slave trade of the Southern states. It is not our intention, nor is it within our province, to enter into details concerning the foreign slave trade. It seems, however, that a brief account is necessary as introductory to the subject of the domestic slave trade. The rise in Europe of the traffic in slaves from Africa was an incident in the commercial expansion of Portugal. It was coeval and almost coextensive with the development of commerce, and followed in the wake of discovery and colonization. The first name connected with it is that of Antonio Gonzalves, who was a marine under Prince Henry the Navigator. In 1441 he was sent to Cape Bojador to get a vessel load of sea-wolf skins. He signalized his voyage by the capture of some Moors, whom he carried to Portugal. In 1442 these Moors promised black slaves as a ransom for themselves. Prince Henry approved of this exchange, and Gonsalves took the captives home and received, among other things, 10 black slaves in exchange for 2 of them. The king justified his act on the grounds that the Negroes might be converted to the Christian religion, but the Moors could not. 2 years later, the Company of Lagos, chartered by the king and engaged in exploration on the coast of Africa, imported about 200 slaves from the islands of Nar and Tidar. This year, 1444, Europe may be said to have made a distinct beginning in the slave trade, henceforth to spread on all sides like the waves in stirred-up water, and not like them to become fainter and fainter as the circles widen. After the discovery of America, the islands, which became known as the Spanish West Indies, were speedily colonized, and the inefficiency of the Indian as a laborer in the mines there soon led to the substitution of the Negro. As early as 1502 a few were employed, and in 1517 Charles V granted a patent to certain traders for the exclusive supply of 4,000 Negroes annually to the islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. So far as known, John Hawkins was the first Englishman to engage in the slave trade. He left England for Sierra Leone with 3 ships and 100 men in 1562, and having secured 300 Negroes, he proceeded to Hispaniola, where he disposed of them, and having had a very profitable voyage, he returned to England in 1563. This appears to have excited the avarice of the British government. The next year Hawkins was appointed to the command of one of the Queen's ships, and proceeded to Africa, where, in company with several others, it appears, he engaged in the slave trade. In 1624 France began the slave trade, and later Holland, Denmark, New England, and other English colonies, though the leader in the trade, and the last to abandon it, was Great Britain. The first slaves introduced into any of the English continental colonies was in 1619, about the last of August, when a piratical Dutch frigate, manned chiefly by English, stopped at Jamestown, Virginia, and sold the colonists 20 negroes. Even for a long while after this, it seems importation of negroes was merely of an occasional or incidental nature. Indeed, in 1648, only 300 negroes were to be found in Virginia. However, several shiploads were brought in between 1664 and 1671, and at the latter date Virginia had 2,000 slaves. During the latter part of the 17th and the early part of the 18th century, the importation of negroes gradually increased. In 1705, 1,800 negroes were brought in, and in 1715, Virginia had 23,000. By 1723, they were being imported into this colony at the rate of 1,500 or 1,600 a year. In the 18th century, Virginia sought from time to time to hinder the introduction of slaves by placing heavy duties on them. Indeed, from 1732 until the Revolution, there were only about 6 months in which slaves could be brought into Virginia free of duty. Nevertheless, in 1776, Virginia had 165,000 slaves. Though all the other colonies imported slaves more or less during the same period, yet, with the possible exception of South Carolina, they fell far short of the number imported by Virginia. In November 1708, Governor Seymour of Maryland, writing to the English Board of Trade, stated that 2,290 negroes were imported into that colony from midsummer 1698 to Christmas 1707. He reported the trade to be running very high, 600 or 700 having been imported during the year. In 1712, there were 8,330 negroes in Maryland. During about the same time, midsummer 1699 to October 1708, Virginia imported 6,607, while a northern colony, New Jersey, imported only 115 from 1698 to 1726. Dubois says that South Carolina received about 3,000 slaves a year from 1733 to 1766. She had 40,000 in 1740. In 1700, North Carolina had 1,100, 1732, 6,000, and in 1764, about 30,000. Until near the beginning of the 18th century, it was rare that the English continental colonies received a shipload of slaves direct from Africa, and even these were usually brought in by some unlicensed interloper. It is very probable that most of the negroes imported before this time were from Barbados, Jamaica, and other West India islands. But by the beginning of the 18th century, it appears that slaves were being imported more rapidly. After the Asiento in 1713, England became a great carrier of slaves, and so continued until the Revolution. The effect of this was very sensibly felt by the colonies. Even in the latter part of the 17th century, some of the colonies began to show their dislike by levying duties on further importation. In the 18th century, the colonial opposition to the importation of slaves, arising probably from a fear of insurrection, became much more pronounced. Heavy restrictions in the form of duties were laid upon the trade. In some cases these were so heavy as would seem to amount to total prohibition. But the efforts on the part of the colonies to restrict the trades were frowned upon, and often disallowed by the British government. In 1754, the instructions to Governor Dobbs of North Carolina were, "Whereas acts have been passed in some of our plantations in America for laying duties on the importation and exportation of negroes, to the great discouragement of the merchants trading thither from the coast of Africa, it is our will and pleasure that you do not give your assent to or pass any law imposing duties upon negroes imported into our province of North Carolina." The colonies considered the slave trade so important to Great Britain that at the dawn of the Revolution some of them appear to have had hopes of bringing her to terms by refusing to import any more slaves. In the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, as submitted by Jefferson, the King of Great Britain is arraigned for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. It has been estimated that in the year of the Declaration, the whole number of slaves in the 13 colonies was 502,132, apportioned as follows: Massachusetts, 3,500, Rhode Island, 4,376, Connecticut, 6,000, New Hampshire, 627, New York, 15,000, New Jersey, 7,600, Pennsylvania, 10,000, Delaware, 9,000, Maryland, 80,000, Georgia, 16,000, North Carolina, 75,000, South Carolina, 110,000, Virginia, 165,000. 2 years after this, in 1778, Virginia took the lead against the introduction of slaves by passing a law prohibiting importation either by land or sea. This law made an exception of travelers and immigrants. Other states soon followed suit, passing laws to restrict it temporarily or at specified places. By 1803, all the states and territories had laws in force prohibiting the importation of slaves from abroad. It must not be supposed, however, that these were entirely effective. Indeed, the statement was made in Congress, February 14, 1804, that in the preceding 12 months 20,000 enslaved Negroes had been transported from Guinea and by smuggling added to the plantation stock of Georgia and South Carolina. In 1798, an act of Congress establishing the territory of Mississippi provided that no slave should be brought within its limits from without the United States. In 1804, when Louisiana was erected into the territories of Louisiana and Orleans, the provision was made that only slaves which had been imported before May 1, 1798, might be introduced into the territories, and these must be the bona fide property of actual settlers. Upon the petition of the inhabitants for the removal of the restrictions, a bill was introduced in Congress, of which Dubois says, "By dexterous wording, this bill, which became a law March 2, 1805, swept away all restrictions upon the slave trade except that relating to foreign ports, and left even this provision so ambiguous that later, by judicial interpretations of the law, the foreign slave trade was allowed at least for a time." South Carolina had even before this time, December 17, 1803, repealed her law against the importation of slaves from Africa. The trade was thus opened through this state for 4 years, during which time 39,075 slaves were imported through Charleston alone. The action of South Carolina in opening the slave trade forced the question upon the attention of Congress. During 1805-6 it was much discussed, but it was not until March 2, 1807, that a bill was passed against it. This prohibited the importation of slaves after January 1, 1808, under penalty of imprisonment for not less than 5 nor more than 10 years, and a fine of not less than $5,000 nor more than $10,000. This law was not entirely effective. In 1810, the Secretary of the Navy, writing to Charleston, South Carolina, says, "I hear, not without great concern, that the law prohibiting the importation of slaves has been violated in frequent instances near St. Mary's." Drake, a slave smuggler, says that during the War of 1812, the business of smuggling slaves through Florida into the United States was a lively one. Vincent Nolte says that in 1813, pirates captured Spanish and other slave ships on the high seas and established their main depot and rendezvous on the island of Barataria, lying near the coast adjacent to New Orleans. This place was visited by the sugar planters, chiefly of French origin, who bought up the stolen slaves at from $150 to $200 per head, when they could not have procured as good stock in the city for less than $600 or $700. These were then conveyed to the different plantations through the innumerable creeks called bayous that communicate with each other by manifold little branches. In 1817 to 1819, slaves were very high and in great demand in the South. As a consequence, great numbers of them were smuggled in at various places. The evidence of this is quite convincing. Amelia Island and the town of St. Mary's became notorious as two of the principal rendezvous of smugglers. A writer in Niles' Register in 1818 says that a regular chain of posts was established from the head of St. Mary's River to the upper country, and through the Indian nation, by means of which slaves were hurried to every part of the country. The woodmen along the riverside rode like so many Arabs loaded with slaves ready for market. When ready to form a caravan, an Indian alarm was created that the woods might be less frequented, and if pursued in Georgia, they escaped to Florida. Mr. McIntosh, collector of the port of Darien, in a letter in 1818, says, "I am in possession of undoubted information that African and West Indian Negroes are almost daily illicitly introduced into Georgia for sale or settlement, or passing through it to the territories of the United States." In 1817, it was reported to the Secretary of the Navy that most of the goods carried to Galveston are introduced into the United States, the most bulky and least valuable regularly through the custom house, the most valuable and the slaves are smuggled in through the numerous inlets to the westward, where the people are but too much disposed to render them every possible assistance. Several hundred slaves are now at Galveston. Niles' Register in 1818, quoting from the Democrat press, has a very interesting account of how the law against the importation of slaves was evaded at New Orleans. An agent would be sent to the West Indies and even to Africa to purchase a cargo of slaves. On the return, when the slave ship got near Belize, the agent would leave her, go in haste to New Orleans, and inform the proper authorities that a certain vessel had come into the Mississippi, said to be bound for New Orleans, and having on board a certain number of Negroes, contrary to the law of the United States. The vessel and cargo would be libeled, and the slaves sold at public auction. One half of the purchase money would go to the informer, and the other to the United States. The informer and agent was the same man, and a partner in the transaction. This was a profitable business, and about 10,000 slaves a year are said to have been thus introduced. It is quite evident that the illicit slave trade at this time was very great. In 1819, Mr. Middleton of South Carolina said in Congress that in his opinion 13,000 Africans were annually smuggled into the United States, and Mr. Wright of Virginia estimated the number at 15,000. In 1818, 1819, and 1820, Congress passed acts to supplement and render more effective the Act of 1807. Dubois says that for a decade after 1825, there appears little positive evidence of a large illicit importation, but thinks notwithstanding that slaves were largely imported. Captain J. E. Alexander, in a book published in 1833, says that he was assured by a planter of 40 years' standing that persons in New Orleans were connected with slave traders in Cuba, and that at certain seasons of the year they would go up the Mississippi River and meet slave ships off the coast. They would relieve these of their cargoes, return to the main stream of the river, dropped down in flatboats, and dispose of the Negroes to those who wished them. Thomas Powell Buxton makes the statement, upon which he claims to be high authority, that 15,000 Negroes were imported into Texas from Africa in 1 year about 1838. The Liberator, quoting the Maryland Colonization Herald, says a writer in that paper assured in 1838 by Pedro Blanco, one of the largest slave traders in the coast of Africa, that for the preceding 40 years the United States had been his best market through the west end of Cuba and Texas. Between 1847 and 1853, says Dubois, the slave smuggler Drake had a slave depot in the Gulf where sometimes as many as 1,600 Negroes were on hand, and the owners were continually importing and shipping. Drake himself says, "Our island was visited almost weekly by agents from Cuba, New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Orleans. The seasoned and instructed slaves were taken to Texas or Florida overland, and to Cuba in sailing boats. As no squad contained more than half a dozen, no difficulty was found in posting them to the United States without discovery, and generally without suspicion. The Bay Island plantation sent ventures weekly to the Florida Keys. Slaves were taken into the great American swamps, and there kept till wanted for market. Hundreds were sold as runaways from the Florida wilderness. We had agents in every slave state, and our coasters were built in Maine and came out with lumber. I could tell curious stories of this business of smuggling Bozal Negroes into the United States. It is growing more profitable every year, and if you should hang all the Yankee merchants engaged in it, hundreds would fill their places." Owing to the increasing demand and to the high price of slaves from 1845 to 1860, and to the fact that the Southern people were becoming more and more favorable to the reopening of the African slave trade, thus making it easier to practice smuggling successfully, we have no reason to doubt the truth of these accounts of this illicit traffic. Stephen A. Douglas said in 1859 it was his confident opinion that more than 15,000 slaves had been imported in the preceding year, and that the trade had been carried on extensively for a long while. About 1860 it was stated that 20 large cities and towns in the South were depots for African slaves, and 60 or 70 cargoes of slaves had been introduced in the preceding 18 months. It was estimated in 1860 that 85 vessels which had been fitted out from New York City during 18 months of 1859 and 1860 would introduce from 30,000 to 60,000 annually. From what has been said, it seems to us certain that at least 270,000 slaves were introduced into the United States from 1808 to 1860 inclusive. These we would distribute as follows: between 1808 and 1820, 60,000; 1820 to 1830, 50,000; 1830 to 1840, 40,000; 1840 to 1850, 50,000; and from 1850 to 1860, 70,000. We consider these very moderate and even low estimates. It will be seen later that these figures are of prime importance in accounting for the presence of certain slaves in the states of the extreme South. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, The Causes of the Rise and Development of the Domestic Slave Trade. The prohibition of the foreign slave trade by the states and the federal government is the first thing to be considered in connection with the development of the internal slave trade. Although before 1808 all the states had passed laws to prohibit the introduction of slaves from without the United States, yet each state had the power to reopen the trade at will. South Carolina, perhaps thinking it might be for the interest of the state, opened the foreign trade in 1803. During the 4 years following, so many slaves were imported that the market in the United States became overstocked, and many of the Negroes were sent to the West Indies for sale. Had the states retained the power to import, it is not probable that the domestic trade would ever have assumed any great importance. It is not likely that the people of the South and West would have paid high prices for the Negroes from the border states when they could have been had from abroad for so much less. The great profits, too, which induced men to carry on the domestic trade would have been wanting. Assuming this, then, the consequent low price of slaves in the border slave states, added to the disinclination of many of these states to make merchandise of the Negro, might have led, as the Negroes increased and became a burden upon their masters, to gradual emancipation. In 1807, however, when Congress exercised its constitutional right and prohibited the importation of slaves from without the United States after January 1, 1808, the right of the individual states to import slaves from foreign countries was lost. It is interesting to note that only a few years before the passage of the Federal Non-Importation Slave Act, the vast majority of Louisiana had been purchased from France. The acquisition of this territory had a wonderful influence upon the development and continuance of the internal slave trade. Of much less influence, and we might even say of comparative insignificance, was the Florida Cession of 1819. In a very short time this fertile region of the Louisiana Purchase began to attract great numbers of immigrants who, it seems, often brought their slaves with them. But there were many who still had to be supplied. To meet this demand, recourse was had, principally, to the exhausted plantations of Virginia and Maryland. Tobacco, which had been a great agricultural staple in these states, had worn out the land. The price of tobacco, too, from about 1818, was very low, and continued so until 1840. At the same time, new states, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, the Carolinas, and Georgia, had become great tobacco states. Such quantities came to be raised as to make the culture very unprofitable in Virginia and Maryland. The condition with respect to this section could be no better illustrated than by a quotation from a speech of Thomas Marshall in the Virginia House of Delegates, January 20, 1832. Mr. Taylor of Carolina, he says, had understood that 60,000 hogsheads of tobacco were imported from Virginia, when the whole population did not exceed 150,000. Had the fertility of the country by possibility remained undiminished, Virginia ought, in 1810, to have exported 240,000 hogsheads, or their equivalent in other produce, and at present nearly double that. Thus, the agricultural exports of Virginia in 1810 would, at the estimated prices of the Custom House at that time, have been 17 millions of dollars, and now at least 34, while it is known that they are not of late years greater than from 3 to 5 millions. The fact that the whole agricultural products of the state at present do not exceed in value the exports 80 or 90 years ago, when it contained not a sixth of the population, and when not a third of the surface of that state, at present Virginia, was at all occupied, is, however, a striking proof of the decline of its agriculture. What is now the productive value of an estate of land and Negroes in Virginia? We state, as the result of extensive inquiry embracing the last 15 years, that a very great proportion of the larger plantations, with from 50 to 100 slaves, actually bring their proprietors in debt at the end of a short term of years, notwithstanding what would once in Virginia have been deemed very sheer economy, that much the larger part of the considerable landholders are content, if they barely meet their plantation expenses without a loss of capital, and that of those who make any profit, it will be none but rare instances average more than 1.5% on the capital invested. The case is not materially varied with the smaller proprietors. Mr. Randolph of Roanoke, whose sayings have so generally the raciness and the truth of proverbs, has repeatedly said in Congress that the time was coming when the masters would run away from the slaves and be advertised by them in the public papers. It seems that agriculture had taken a new start about 1816, probably owing to the fact that tobacco was very high, being from 8 to 15 cents per pound, for Colonel Mercer, in the Virginia Constitutional Convention of 1829, said that in 1817 the lands of Virginia were valued at $206 millions, and that Negroes averaged $300 each. While by 1829 lands had decreased in value to $80 million or $90 million and Negroes to $150 each. But while agriculture was in such a discouraging condition in the worn-out states, Louisiana and other states of the Southwest were being opened up and were looked on as the land of promise. Immigrants to that favored section wrote glowing accounts of the fertility of the country and of the delightful climate. An immigrant from Maryland writes from Louisiana in 1817, "Do not the climate, the soil, and productions of this country furnish allurements to the application of your Negroes on our lands? In your state, a planter with 10 Negroes with difficulty supports a family genteelly. Here, well managed, they would be a fortune to him. With you, the seasons are so irregular, your crops often fail. Here the crops are certain, and want of the necessaries of life never for a moment causes the heart to ache. Abundance spreads the table of the poor man, and contentment smiles on every countenance." In marked contrast to the unprofitableness of slave labor in the older slave states was their immense profit when employed on the fresh lands of the Southwest. Some planters in this section had plantations thousands of acres in extent. To cultivate them, great numbers of slaves were required. If the crop were cotton, 1 Negro was needed for every 3 acres, and these would yield cotton to the value of $240 to $260. The master realized upon each Negro employed at least $200 annually. The income of some of these plantations was immense. It was not uncommon for a planter in Mississippi and Louisiana to have an income of $30,000, and some of them even $80,000 to $120,000 (1820). The enormous profits caused slaves to be very high in this section and in great demand. There were only 2 possible sources of supply. First, the illicit traffic already spoken of. Second, the domestic slave trade. A good Negro from 20 to 30 years of age would command from $800 to $1,200. Indeed, it is stated that at one time during this early period they sold for as much as $2,000. This fact, in connection with the fact that in 1817 the average price of a Negro in Virginia was only $300, and the depreciation by 1829 to $150, gives us the reason for the rise of the domestic slave trade. It was over and again stated in the Virginia legislature of 1832 that the value of Negroes in Virginia was regulated not by their profitableness at home, but by the southwestern demand. The great difference in the price of slaves in the buying states and the selling states was an inducement to a certain class of men to engage in the business of buying them up and carrying them south. The profits were from 1/3 to 1/2 on an average after expenses were paid. Slave traders soon got rich. Williams, a Washington dealer, boasted in 1850 that he made $30,000 in a few months. It is said the firm of Franklin and Armfield of Alexandria made $33,000 in 1829. In 1834, Armfield of this same firm was reputed to be worth nearly $500,000, which he had accumulated in the business. Ingram tells of a man who had amassed more than $1 million in this traffic. More instances might be given, but this is enough to show that the traffic was profitable. The cultivation of rice and sugar, especially sugar, used up slaves rapidly. As a consequence, slaves were in demand in the rice and sugar sections, not only because of the expansion of these industries, but to take the place of those that died. In 1829, the statement was made in a report of the Agricultural Society of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that the annual loss of life on well-conducted sugar plantations was 2 1/2% more than the annual increase. In 1830, the Honorable J.L. Johnson, in a letter to the Secretary of the Treasury, gave evidence of a thorough study of the subject and arrived at the same conclusion. We come now to consider the one thing, the prime factor, which brought about the wonderful agricultural prosperity of the Southwest: cotton. Sugar and rice could only be grown in certain limited sections. Rice principally in South Carolina, and sugar in Louisiana, but the cotton field came to cover the larger part of 9 great states. Until toward the end of the 18th century, the production of cotton in this country was very small. In 1793, however, Eli Whitney invented his machine for separating the seed from the cotton. This soon revolutionized the industry. While the cotton crop of the United States in 1793 was only 5 million pounds, by 1808 it had increased to 80 million, and remained about the same, or rather declined, during the War of 1812, but the very year peace was established, its production went up to 100 million pounds, and the year following, 1816, to 125 million. By 1834, it had grown to 460 million. During the whole of this period, with slight fluctuations, cotton continued high, but after 1835 it began to decline and reached low water mark at the average price of 5 3/4 cents per pound in 1845, which was scarcely the cost of production. However, the crop of 1839, according to the census reports, was 790,479,275 pounds, nearly double the crop of the 5 years previous. During the next decade, though the price went up after 1845, the crop increased less than 200 million pounds, being only 987,637,200 in 1849. But during the following 10 years, it more than doubled, being 2,397,238,140 pounds in 1859. Of this enormous crop, the 4 states of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia produced more than 2/3, while Virginia contributed about 1,400. But Virginia and North Carolina in 1801 had produced more than 2/5 of the cotton raised in the country. In 1826, when, according to the official reports, they reached their greatest production, Virginia grew 25 million pounds, and North Carolina 18 million pounds, or nearly 5 times as much as in 1801. Yet this proportion had fallen to about 1/7. 8 years afterward, Virginia's crop had fallen to 10 million pounds, and North Carolina's to 9,500,000, and their production continued to decline. Hammond says that the higher cost of raising cotton in the more northern latitudes, and the uncertainty of the plant reaching maturity before the arrival of the frosts, prevented the rapid growth of cotton culture in these states after 1830, which took place elsewhere, especially as the continual decline in the price of the staple only emphasized the disadvantages under which the planters of these states labored. But while decline was noticeable in the northern states, the states at the Southwest were going ahead by leaps and bounds. The same year, 1843, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, from which no cotton had been reported in 1801, produced together 232 million pounds, while South Carolina increased its crops from 2 million to 65,500,000, and Georgia from 10 million to 75 million pounds during the same time. As the cotton field extended, of course the demand for labor increased, and that labor was necessarily Negro slave labor, for it was thought that the white man could not endure work under a tropical sun, while the organism of the Negro was especially adapted to it. As a consequence, Negroes were secured from every possible source. In short, Negroes and cotton soon came to be inseparably associated. The amount of cotton that could be raised depended upon the number of Negroes to be secured to work it. The value of a Negro was measured by his usefulness in the cotton field. Debeau estimated that in 1850, out of the 2,500,000 slaves in the Southern States, about 1,800,000 of them, or nearly three-fourths, were engaged in the cotton industry, leaving for all other purposes only about 700,000, or about the same number as there was in the whole United States in 1790, at which time the production of cotton was only 1,500,000 pounds. Thus it is seen that while cotton demanded all the increase of slaves from whatever source from that time forward, all other things merely held their own. However, if we subtract the number engaged in the sugar industry, which was 150,000 in 1850, for the reason that it was a new crop developed during the early part of the century, it is noticed that other things lost. From this we conclude it was only natural that the supply slave population of the older slave states, where it was useless, was to be drained off to the cotton states. Some of the Southern papers, notably the Richmond Enquirer, over and again called attention to the relation of cotton and Negroes. In 1859 it says, "The price of cotton, it is well known, pretty much regulates the price of slaves in the South, and a bale of cotton and a likely nigger are about well balanced in the scale of pecuniary appreciation." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Amount and Extent of the Trade. We have already discussed the causes of the domestic slave trade. In this chapter it is our purpose chiefly to consider its amount and extent. In this connection, our first object will be to determine whether it was carried on as a business before 1808. It appears that there were exchanges of slaves going on among the states and territories before this time, but whether this was anything more than of an occasional or incidental nature is a question. The statutes of some of the states give some light along this line. South Carolina, in 1792, prohibited the introduction of slaves either by land or sea. Delaware, however, as early as 1787, passed a law which recites that "sundry Negroes and mulattoes, as well freemen as slaves, have been exported and sold into other states, contrary to the principles of humanity and justice, and derogatory to the honor of this state." This law prohibited their exportation without a permit. It seems to have been something more than merely incidental, for it was amended in 1793 as follows: "That from and after the first Tuesday of October next, the Justice of the Court of General Quarter Sessions and Jail Delivery, or any two of them, shall have the like power to grant a license or permit to export, sell, or carry out for sale any Negro or mulatto slave from the state that 5 Justices of the Peace in open sessions now have." We have evidence to show that by 1802, Alexandria, in the District of Columbia, had become a sort of depot for the sale of slaves, and that men visited it from distant parts of the United States in order to purchase them. About this time, slaves were in great demand and very high in Mississippi, and probably also in the new states of Kentucky and Tennessee. However, it is not to be supposed that the great increase of the slave population in these sections before 1815 was due to any great extent to the domestic slave trade. There were 5 causes which may be assigned for this increase, of which the domestic trade was probably among the least, if not the least. No doubt the most important was the immigration of slaveholders with their slaves. This immigration was considerable. The white population of Tennessee and Kentucky nearly trebled between 1790 and 1800, and between 1800 and 1810 it about doubled, and the population of Mississippi more than quadrupled between 1800 and 1810. Slaves also increased in as great a ratio. Second, we consider the South Carolina slave trade from 1804 to 1807 inclusive. From a speech of Mr. Smith of South were sold in the Carolinas, but that the most of Carolina in the United States Senate, December 8, 1820, we learn that only a small part of the Negroes introduced in consequence of this trade them were bought by the people of the western and southwestern states and territories. Third was the natural increase. Fourth would be the illegal foreign slave trade, and fifth is the domestic trade. It is impossible to more than approximate the relative importance of these factors. However, it seems very unlikely that the domestic trade was of much consequence before 1815. Whatever impetus it may have received on account of the demand for slaves just prior to the South Carolina trade must have been checked by the consequent heavy importation from abroad. For on account of this, slaves fell in price, as it is said adults at this time generally sold in the Southwest at $100 each. If the domestic slave trade had assumed any importance, or even if it had been going on at all before 1815, it seems more than likely that it would have been remarked by travelers, many of whom, both English and American, visited the Southwest and other sections of the country during the period in question. But so far as we can find, none of them make any mention of it whatever. The newspapers of the time, also, are silent in regard to the matter. Doubtless, the rise and development of the trade was hindered or delayed by the War of 1812, but almost immediately after the close of the war, it comes into notice and even prominence. In 1816, Paulding, in his Letters from the South, writes of it from personal observation, and also tells of a man who had even thus early made money in the business. At this time, indeed, conditions were very favorable to a growth of the domestic trade. The general prosperity and the high price of agricultural products, especially cotton and sugar, caused a great demand for slave labor for the new and fertile lands of the South and Southwest. In 1817 and 1818, the buying up of the Negroes for these markets was fast becoming a regular business, and it was a very common thing to see gangs of them chained and marching toward the South. They were collected from various places by dealers and shipped down the Mississippi River in flatboats. 14 of these, loaded with slaves for sale, were seen at Natchez at once about this time. The statement was made that 8,000 slaves were carried into Georgia in 1817 from the northern slaveholding states. It would seem probable that the greater part of these may have been introduced by immigrants. However, the slave trade must have been great, for on December 20, 1817, the Georgia legislature passed a law to prohibit at once the importation of slaves for sale. Between 1810 and 1820, slaves in the 4 states of Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Louisiana, in round numbers, increased from 202,000 to 332,000, and in some of the other states the increase was about as great. During the same time, the white population in the states named increased from 419,000 to 645,000. By far the greater part of this increase took place after 1815. To prove this, we will take Louisiana as an example. In 1810, she had a population of 76,500, and in 1815, near the close of the year, her population, according to Monette, did not exceed 90,000, an increase of only 12,000. But in 1820 it amounted to 154,000, of which more than 73,000 were Negro slaves. It appears that the slaves in Louisiana increased only about 2,000 or 2,500 from 1810 to 1815, but between 1815 and 1820 there was an increase of about 37,000. This wonderful increase in population in the West and Southwest is to be accounted for by the fact that after the close of the War of 1812, immigration again set in these directions, and as most of the immigrants without doubt were from the older Southern states, they carried with them the slaves which they had in their native states. Another source from which this region received slaves at this time was through the operation of the illicit foreign trade. It is probable that 10,000 or 15,000 a year were thus introduced. It therefore seems that up to this time to the domestic trade is due probably only a minor part of the increase of the slave population of this section. During the 20s, however, if we are to give credit to the statements of travelers, the trade reached very great proportions. Baltimore, Norfolk, Richmond, Washington, and other places had already become centers. Agents were placed in these cities to attend to purchase and shipment, and thousands and tens of thousands, such is the language of an English tourist, were purchased in Virginia and Maryland for sale in Georgia, Louisiana, and other states. Blaine, another Englishman who visited the United States about the same time, is more to the point. It is computed, he says, that every year from 10 to 15,000 slaves are sold from the states of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, and sent to the South. Basil Hall was informed in 1827 or 1828 that during certain seasons of the year, all the roads, steamboats, and packets are crowded with troops of Negroes on their way to the slave markets of the South. Vessels, indeed, from the selling states are sometimes seen in New Orleans with as many as 200 Negroes aboard. This transportation of Negroes from the border states to the South and Southwest from about 1826 to 1832 may be partly accounted for by the probable falling off in the illicit importations and by the fact that cotton and tobacco, which were the staples of some of the border states, were comparatively low in price, making them very unprofitable crops to cultivate in these states. The cotton raised in North Carolina and Virginia decreased almost half during this time. While it appears as if the lower price of cotton merely had the effect in the new states to increase the acreage in order to make up for the deficiency in price. In the new states there was a wonderful increase in production during this period. Slaves, therefore, were of much less productive value in the border states, while in the new states the demand for them was scarcely lessened. The New Orleans Mercantile Advertiser of January 21, 1830, says, "Arrivals by sea and river within a few days have added fearfully to the number of slaves brought to this market for sale. New Orleans is the complete mart for the slave trade, and the Mississippi is becoming a common highway for the traffic." In the summer of 1831, New Orleans imported 371 Negroes in 1 week, nearly all of whom were from Virginia. In the same year, August 1831, an insurrection of slaves in which a number of white people were murdered occurred in Southampton County, Virginia. This caused much excitement throughout the slave states. It opened the eyes of the people to the danger of a large slave population. It seemed for a while that it would have a very detrimental effect upon the domestic slave trade, for several importing states began to consider the advisability of prohibiting the further introduction of slaves. 2 of the largest importing states, indeed, passed such laws. Louisiana, which in March 1831 had repealed her law regulating the importation of slaves, in November of the same year, at an extra session of her legislature, enacted a law against their importation for sale, and in January 1832 Alabama followed suit. The Virginia legislature of 1831, too, also took up the question of slavery, and with open doors vigorously discussed methods of emancipation and of getting rid of the Negro population. It was recognized that the value of slaves in Virginia depended greatly upon the Southern and Western markets. It was feared that other buying states would follow the lead of Louisiana, thus cutting off the outlet of Virginia's surplus slaves, and while the whites were constantly emigrating, the rapidly increasing black population would tend to become congested in the state, producing a condition of society alarming to contemplate. But these forebodings were far from ever being realized. Indeed, even before the end of the year, the conjunction of two causes produced a great demand for slaves, and they were soon higher in price than they had been for years. First, planters from the cotton-growing states visited Virginia in great numbers in order to make purchases of slaves, doubtless thinking they could buy cheaply, as it seemed that on account of the Southampton insurrection, Virginia was determined to get rid of her slaves at all hazards. Second, the most important was the advance in price of cotton. This began also in 1832. It continued to rise for several years, and by 1836 it had doubled in price, while by 1839 its production also had nearly doubled. This increase was due almost wholly to the South and Southwest, Mississippi alone producing nearly one-fourth of the entire crop. As a consequence, we should expect to note a corresponding briskness in the slave trade. Such indeed was the case. We have no reason to think that more slaves were ever exported to the South from the northern slave states during any equal period of time than there were from 1832 to 1836 inclusive. Of these, 1836 is easily the banner year. In 1832, it was estimated by Professor Dew that Virginia annually exported for sale to other states 6,000 slaves. During the 30s, or even before the slave trade was carried on between the selling and buying states, with about the same regularity as the exchanges of cotton, flour, sugar, and rice, vessels engaged in the business advertised their accommodations. One trader, John Armfield, had 3 which were scheduled to leave Alexandria for New Orleans alternately, the 1st and 15th of each month during the shipping season. That the trade had become extensive is evidenced by the newspapers. Up to 1820 it was very uncommon to find a trader's advertisement in a newspaper, but even before 1830 such advertisements had become very plentiful. One could hardly pick up a paper published in the selling states, especially those of the eastern shore of Maryland and eastern Virginia, without finding one or more. These advertisements often continued from month to month and from year to year. An example or two may be interesting. Cash for Negroes. I wish to purchase 600 or 700 Negroes for the New Orleans market, and will give more than any purchaser that is now or hereafter may come into the market. Richard C. Woolfolk. Cash for Negroes. We will give cash for 200 Negroes between the ages of 15 and 25 years old of both sexes. Those having that kind of property for sale will find it to their interest to give us a call. Finnall and Freeman. The number of slaves currently estimated to have been transported to the South and Southwest during 1835 and 1836 almost staggers belief. The Maryville, Tennessee Intelligencer made the statement in 1836 that in 1835 60,000 slaves passed through a western town on their way to the southern market. Also in 1836, the Virginia Wheeling Times says intelligent men estimated the number of slaves exported from Virginia during the preceding 12 months as 120,000, of whom about 2/3 were carried there by their masters, leaving 40,000 to have been sold. The Quarterly Anti-Slavery Magazine, July 1837, gives the Natchez Courier as authority for the estimate that during 1836 250,000 slaves were transported to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the older slave states. A committee in 1837, appointed by the citizens of Mobile to inquire into the cause of the prevalent financial stringency, stated in their report that for the preceding 4 years, Alabama had annually purchased from the other states $10 million worth of slave property. When the Panic of 1837 came upon Mississippi, it was thought, it seems, to have been caused through the amount of money sent out of the state in the purchase of slaves, and Governor Lynch, upon the petition of the people, convened the legislature in extra session, and in his message to it says: "The question which presents itself, and which I submit for your deliberation, is whether the passage of an act prohibiting the introduction of slaves into this state as merchandise may not have a salutary effect in checking the drain of capital annually made upon us by the sale of this description of property." The Panic of 1837 caused a falling off in the domestic slave trade, and the low price of cotton, which continued until 1846, hindered its revival. The falling off in the trade is shown by the fact that the percent of increase in the slave population of the cotton states was scarcely half as great between 1840 and 1850 as during the previous decade. The slave trade, however, seems to have become brisker in 1843, for while only 2,000 slaves are said to have been sold in Washington in 1842, in 1843 5,000 were sold there. It does not necessarily follow, however, that all these were sent south. The increased number of sales was caused by two things: the decline in the price of tobacco, and the renewed activity in the sugar industry incident upon a new duty on sugar. This gave rise to a demand for slave labor upon the sugar plantations of the South, but it was a very limited demand. During this period, the decline in the value of slaves was great in some states, and it appears very probable there was a general depreciation in value. However, before 1850, 3 important things had happened, each of which had an effect upon the slave trade. First, the admission of Texas, December 1845. Second, the gradual increase in the price of cotton after 1845. Third, the discovery of gold in California. The first opened a large cotton country to development, and the required slave labor could be legally supplied only from the United States. The rise in cotton, which continued almost uniformly until 1860, caused a new impetus to be given to its culture, and the discovery of gold in California infused new life into all the channels of trade. In a few years, indeed, after 1845, the demand for slaves seems to have been greater than the supply. A writer in the Richmond Examiner in 1849 says, "It being a well-ascertained fact that Virginia and Maryland will not be able to supply the great demand for Negroes which will be wanted in the South this fall and next spring, we would advise all who are compelled to dispose of them in this market to defer selling until the sales of the present crop of cotton can be realized, as the price then must be very high owing to 2 reasons. First, the ravages of the cholera, and secondly, the high price of cotton." Indeed, during the 15 years prior to 1860, the demand for slaves became so great that it caused an increase of 100% in their price. However, there was not a great increase in the domestic slave trade. According to a Custom House report, there were shipped from Baltimore in a little less than 2 years, in 1851 and 1852, only 1,033 Negroes. This is certainly not a large showing, though it is probable a great many were sent overland to the South from this place during the same time. In a speech before the Southern Convention at Savannah in 1856, Mr. Scott of Virginia made the statement that not more than half the lands in the sugar and cotton-growing states had been reduced to cultivation, and that all the valuable slaves in Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri would be required to develop them. But at this time the prosperity of the latter militated against the transfer of labor to the cotton-growing states. Probably the conditions in the border states is best described by quoting from a writer in Debau's Review in 1857. "The difficulty," he says, "of procuring slaves at reasonable rates has already been severely felt by the cotton planters, and this difficulty is constantly increasing. The production of rice, tobacco, wheat, Indian corn, etc., with stock raising in those states affords nearly as profitable employment for slave labor as cotton planting in other states. They have not, as is generally supposed, a redundancy of slave labor, nor are they likely to have, so long as their present prosperity continues. The recent full development of the rich agricultural and mineral resources of these states, indeed, by an immense demand for their staple productions, have not only given profitable employment to slave labor, but has improved the pecuniary condition of the slave owner, and placed him above the necessity of parting with his slave property." Even Olmsted, inadvertently no doubt, gives evidence of the prosperity of Virginia a little before this time, when he says that in the tobacco factories of Richmond and Petersburg, slaves were in great demand and received $150 to $200 and expenses a year. In North Carolina also, good hands would bring about the same wages. Though the labor market in the border states was greater than the natural increase of the Negro, yet it was hardly to be compared to the Southern demand. As a consequence, when debt or necessity or other reason compelled the sale of slaves, they were often bought by traders and exported. The statement was made by Mr. Jones of Georgia in the Savannah Convention, 1856, that Negroes were even then worth from $1,000 to $1,500 each, and that there were 10 purchasers to 1 seller. Indeed, so great was the demand for slaves at this time that the advisability of reopening the African slave trade became one of the principal topics of discussion in Southern agricultural and commercial conventions. In fact, the Vicksburg Convention, 1859, passed a resolution in favor of reopening the African trade. The New Orleans newspapers during all this period give evidence of the domestic trade. It was very common during the shipping season to see advertisements to the effect that the subscriber, a Negro trader, had received or had just arrived from Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, or elsewhere, with a large lot of Negroes which were offered for sale. Usually the number would be given as 50, 75, or even 100. This would be qualified by the statement that they would be constantly receiving fresh lots. The same advertisement would continue in the same paper for months and even years. Sometimes half a dozen of these could be found in a single issue of a paper. It would be impossible even to approximate from this source the number sold during any given time, for it is likely the number offered for sale bore but little relation to the actual number sold. The states of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas were most conspicuous in these advertisements. Writers on the subject seem to be pretty well agreed that during this period, or during the 50s, about 25,000 slaves were annually sold south from the northern slave states. It is interesting to notice in this connection what the census reports have to show. But in reading, it should be remembered that no account is taken of the sale of slaves except as they took place between the buying and selling states. So the sale of slaves between Virginia and Maryland are not indicated, nor those between Mississippi and Alabama. The slave population of Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri in 1820 was in round numbers 644,000. In 1830, 997,000, being an increase of 353,000. The slave population in the selling states of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, Kentucky, and the District of Columbia at the same periods was 873,000 and 993,000 respectively, being an increase in these states of 120,000. Total increase of slaves in both sections during the decade 473,000, from which we deduct 50,000 due to the illicit foreign trade, leaving 423,000 from natural increase, or about 28%. Had the selling states increased at this ratio, instead of 120,000, their increase would have been 244,000. This would seem to indicate that at least 12,400 annually were carried south during this decade. However, only the smaller part of these, and those of the following decade as well, were transported through the operation of the domestic slave trade. Mr. P.A. Morse of Louisiana, writing in 1857, says that the augmentation of slaves within the cotton states was caused mostly by the migration of slave owners. The Virginia Times in 1836 says of the number of slaves exported during the preceding 12 months, not more than 1/3 have been sold, the others having been carried by their owners who have removed. We conclude from these and other sources that at least 3/5 of the removals of slaves from the border slave states to those farther south from 1820 to 1850 were due to emigration. Thus, it is shown that probably 5,000 slaves were annually exported by the selling states from 1820 to 1830 by means of the domestic trade. In the next decade, adding Florida to the buying states and transferring South Carolina and Missouri to the selling list, we find that in 1830 and in 1840 the buying states had 672,000 and 1,127,000 respectively, being an increase of 455,000. While for the same periods the selling states had 133,000 and 1,361,000, being an increase of 28,000. The whole increase, therefore, was 483,000, deducting 40,000 due to illicit foreign trade. We have 443,000, or about 22%, as the natural increase. Had the selling states increased at the same rate, it would have been 293,000 for the decade. Deducting 28,000, we find that 265,000 can be accounted for only as having been exported. Deducting 3/5 for immigration, we have, removing 106,000 for the domestic traffic, an average of 10,600 per year. By 1850, the buying states had another increase of 478,000, and the selling states 180,000. Total increase from 1840 to 1850, 658,000. Deducting 50,000 illicitly imported, we have 606,000, or about 24% total increase. Accordingly, the selling states should have a natural increase of 326,000. Deducting the actual number, we have left 146,000, which must have been transported. Deducting 3/5 on account of immigration, there would remain about 58,000, or nearly 6,000 per year for the domestic trade. Adding Texas to the buying states in 1850, they then have 1,663,000, and in 1860, 2,296,000, or an increase of 633,000 during the decade. And the selling states 1,541,000 and 1,657,000 respectively, being an increase of 116,000. Total increase of 749,000. Deducting 70,000, which were brought in by illicit trade, we have a remainder of 679,000, or 21% natural increase. From natural increase, selling states should have had 207,000 more than the actual. Deducting 3/5 on account of immigration leaves a little more than 8,000 per year sold south annually for these 10 years. It is very probable that the immigration to the cotton states fell off during the 50s owing to the great prosperity in the border states, and it might be fair to reduce the number estimated to have been carried south by immigration to 1/3 or 1/2, which would leave 10,000 or 12,000 per year for the domestic slave trade. We feel quite confident that this statistical review of the domestic slave trade, based as it is upon the census reports, gives a truer idea of the actual amount of the trade between the selling and the buying states than could be got from any other sources. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Were some states engaged in breeding and raising Negroes for sale? As we now have a somewhat definite idea as to the amount of the domestic slave trade, the next question which naturally claim our attention are: were some states consciously and purposely engaged in breeding and raising Negroes for the Southern market? And also, what were the sources of supply for the trade? The former of these queries is, no doubt, the most controverted and difficult part of our subject. The testimony of travelers and common opinion generally seems to have been in the affirmative. A quotation or two will suffice to show the trend. The Duke of Saxe-Weimar says, "Many owners of slaves in the states of Maryland and Virginia have nurseries for slaves, whence the planters of Louisiana, Mississippi, and other Southern states draw their supplies." In a narrative of a visit to the American churches, the writer, in speaking of the accumulation of Negroes in the Gulf states, says, "Slaves are generally bred in some states as cattle for the Southern market." And the Reverend Philo Tower, writing about 20 years later, draws a more vivid picture. Not only in Virginia, he says, but also in Maryland, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, as much attention is paid to the breeding and growth of Negroes as to that of horses and mules. It is a common thing for planters to command their girls and women, married or not, to have children, and I am told a great many Negro girls are sold off, simply and mainly because they did not have children. Undoubtedly, some planters in all the slave states resorted to questionable means of increasing their slave stock, but that it was a general custom to multiply Negroes in order to have them to sell is very improbable. Many of these travelers show prejudice. We have wondered, therefore, whether it were too much to assume that they had more thought for the effect their narrative would produce in the North or in England than for its truth. Is it not probable that foreigners may have got their information about breeding slaves when in the free states, rather than actual evidence of such an industry, where the industry was supposed to be carried on? It seems, at any rate, more than probable that the exceptional cases which they found were made to appear as the general rule. Then, too, the very fact that some states sold great numbers of slaves was sufficient evidence to some, no doubt, that they were engaged in the business of raising them for sale. It seems very natural that this should be inferred. Consequently, travelers reported that certain sections were engaged in breeding and raising slaves for market. They made the accusation that the so-called breeding states were in the slave-breeding business for profit. But was it profitable? If not, why were they in this business? A Negro above 18 years of age would bring, on an average, about $300 in the selling states from 1815 to, say, 1845. Sometimes he would bring a little more, sometimes less. Between the age of 10 and the time of sale, we will suppose the slave paid for his keeping. But before that time he would be too small to work. There was always some defective stock that could not be sold. This, taken in connection with the fact that all Negroes did not live to be 10 years of age, probably not more than half, we shall be under the necessity of deducting about one-half of the $300 on this account. This will leave $150, or $15 per year, for the possible expense of raising him. A bushel of corn a month would have been about $8 per year for corn, 50 pounds for meat, $4. It is not likely he could have been clothed for less than $3, and the 15 is gone, with nothing left for incidentals. We think the above a very fair estimate. In 1829, the average price of Negroes in Virginia was estimated at only $150 each. Why did not the border slave states raise hogs instead of Negroes? Bacon was at a good price during that period. The fact is, the Negroes probably increased without any consideration for their master's wishes in the matter. A planter could stop raising hogs whenever he might choose, but it seemed to be hardly within the province of the master to limit the increase of his Negroes, and the better they were treated, evidently, the faster the increase. A man who had 100 or 200 Negroes and had scruples about selling them, unless he should be able to add to his landed estate as they increased, was in a bad predicament. It seemed some such men had the welfare of their Negroes at heart, and used every means to keep them. Andrew tells of one. A gentleman, he says, in one of the poorer counties of Virginia, has nearly 200 slaves, whom he employs upon a second-rate plantation of 8,000 or 10,000 acres, and who constantly brought him into debt. At length he found it necessary to purchase a smaller plantation of good land in another county, which he continues to cultivate for no other purpose than to support his Negroes. Sometimes men who were in prosperous circumstances would buy land as fast as their slaves increased and settle them upon it. Slaves were seldom sold until they were over 10 years of age. Consequently, if it were true that the border states made a business of breeding and raising them for sale, we should naturally expect to find in these states a much greater proportion under 10 than in the buying states. To determine the truth of this, we shall have recourse to the census reports. The states of Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, and North Carolina in 1830 had, in round numbers, 984,000 slaves, of which 349,000 were under 10 years of age, and 635,000 over. This shows that in these states there were 182 over 10 years of age to every 100 under 10. Taking an equal number of the principal cotton-growing and slave-buying states, say Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, we find that they had 346,000 over 10 and 196,000 under 10. Consequently, for every 176 of the former, they had 100 of the latter. Therefore, at this time, the principal so-called slave-breeding states had a smaller number of slaves under 10 years than an equal number of buying states. The numbers, it will be seen, differ as the ratios 100 to 182 and 100 to 176. In 1840, there were in the Southern states about 2,486,000 slaves, of whom about 844,000 were under 10 years of age, on an average, therefore, of 100 under 10 to every 194 over. Taking each state separately, we find that Virginia had just an average, having 100 of the former to 194 of the latter. Maryland, 100 to every 203, Delaware, 100 to 218, District of Columbia, 100 to 280, Kentucky, 100 to 179, North Carolina, 100 to 176, Missouri, 100 to 172, South Carolina, 100 to 205, Louisiana, 100 to 267, Mississippi, 100 to 206, Florida, 100 to 220, Georgia, 100 to 188, Arkansas, 100 to 195, Tennessee, 100 to 170, and Alabama, 100 to 190. Thus, it is shown that the buying states of Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee each had more children in proportion to their slave population than Virginia, and that Maryland and Delaware had about the same proportion as the buying states of Mississippi, Florida, and Arkansas. It would hardly be fair, however, to compare the District of Columbia with Louisiana. In 1860, we find that the proportion of slave children under 10 years of age is much less in all the states than in 1840. In Virginia at this time, there were 100 under 10 years of age to 227 over that age. Delaware, 100 to 233, Maryland, 100 to 229, Kentucky, 100 to 204, South Carolina, 100 to 224, North Carolina, 100 to 202, Missouri, 100 to 190, Georgia, 100 to 221, Louisiana, 100 to 285, Mississippi, 100 to 242, Texas, 100 to 209, Arkansas, 100 to 219, Tennessee, 100 to 200, Alabama, 100 to 221, and Florida, 100 to 224. This schedule shows that the buying states, which had a greater number of slave children in proportion to their slave population in 1860 than Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, were Georgia, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Texas, and Florida. It is noticeable in both schedules that the state of Louisiana is an exception. The proportion of children there was much less than in the other states. This is probably due to the strenuous work on sugar plantations. It is also noticeable that the western states had the greatest proportional number of children, which is to be accounted for by the healthfulness of the climate and by its being a rich and prosperous farming region where Negroes were well fed and probably free from the malarial ailments of some other sections. The conditions, therefore, were very favorable to the prolific Negro race. We think it would be only natural that one should expect to have found in Virginia and Maryland, which have had to bear the brunt of the accusation of breeding slaves, the greatest proportion of children, not only because of the reiterated accusations, but also on account of the exportation of adult slaves from these states, which had the tendency to heighten the proportion of children in these states and lessen it in the states to which the slaves were carried. With regard to slave breeding, Schaffner, a native of Virginia, says, "From our own personal observation, since we were capable of studying the progress of human affairs, we are of opinion that there is less increase of the slaves of the so-called breeding states than of the more southern of Gulf states. We doubt if there exists in America a slave owner that encourages the breeding of slaves for the purpose of selling them, nor do we believe that any man would be permitted to live in any of the southern states that did intentionally breed slaves with the object of selling them." Southerners generally have denied the accusation. When Andrew Stevenson of Virginia was minister to England, he was, upon one occasion, taunted by Daniel O'Connell with belonging to a state that was noted for breeding slaves for the South. He indignantly denied the charge, and in 1839 the editor of the Cincinnati Gazette was much abused for asserting that Virginia bred slaves as a matter of pecuniary gain. Nehemiah Adams, a clergyman, went South in the early 50s, biased against slavery, but says, "The charge of vilely multiplying Negroes in Virginia is one of those exaggerations of which the subject is full, and is reduced to this, that Virginia, being an old state fully stocked, the surplus black population naturally flows off where their numbers are less." It would seem that these states are not only practically freed from the charge of multiplying slaves and raising them for market as a business, but that as a rule they did not sell their slaves unless compelled to do so by pecuniary or other embarrassments. Probably many planters were as conscientious about their slaves as Jefferson appears to have been. In a letter he says, "I cannot decide to sell my lands. I have sold too much of them already, and they are the only sure provision for my children, nor would I willingly sell the slaves as long as there remains any prospect of paying my debts with their labor." It seems that he was finally compelled to sell some of them. Madison parted with some of his best land to feed the increasing numbers of Negroes, but admitted to Harriet Martineau that the week before she visited him he had been obliged to sell a dozen of them. And Eastwick Evans, who made a long tour of the country in 1818, says, "I know it to be a case that slaveholders generally deprecate the practice of buying and selling slaves. No doubt the planters were always glad to get rid of unruly and good-for-nothing Negroes, and these were pretty sure to fall into the hands of traders." The slave traders had agents spread over the states where slaves were less profitable to their owners, in readiness to take advantage of every opportunity to secure the slaves that might in any way be for sale. They would, even when an opportunity occurred, kidnap the free Negroes. They also sought to buy up slaves as if for local and domestic use, and then would disappear with them. And it was a common occurrence for plantations and Negroes to be advertised for sale. In one issue of the Charleston Courier in the winter of 1835 were advertised several plantations and about 1,200 Negroes for sale. At such sales, Negro traders and speculators from far and near were sure to be on hand, attracted by the prospect of making good bargains. Probably we could not better close this chapter than with a quotation from Dr. Bailey, who was editor of the National Era, a moderate anti-slavery paper. It appears to us that he correctly and concisely sums up the whole matter. "The sale of slaves to the South," he says, "is carried on to a great extent. The slaveholders do not, so far as I can learn, raise them for that special purpose. But here is a man with a score of slaves located on an exhausted plantation. It must furnish support for all. But while they increase, its capacity of supply decreases. The result is he must emancipate or sell. But he has fallen into debt, and he sells to relieve himself of debt, and also from the excess of mouths. Or he requires money to educate his children, or his Negroes are sold under execution. From these and other causes, large numbers of slaves are continually disappearing from the state." The Davises in Petersburg are the great slave dealers. They are Jews who came to that place many years ago as poor peddlers. These men are always in the market, giving the highest price for slaves. During the summer and fall they buy them up at low prices, trim, shave, wash them, fatten them so that they may look sleek, and sell them to great profit. There are many planters who cannot be persuaded to sell their slaves. They have far more than they can find work for, and could at any time obtain a high price for them. The temptation is strong, for they want more money and fewer dependents, but they resist it, and nothing can induce them to part with a single slave, though they know that they would be greatly the gainers, in a pecuniary sense, were they to sell one half of them. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. The Kidnapping and Selling of Free Negroes into Slavery. Virginia, as early as 1753, enacted a law against importation of free Negroes for sale and stealing of slaves. In 1788, another law was passed against kidnapping. It recited that several evil-disposed persons had seduced or stolen children or mulatto and black free persons, and that there was no law adequate for such offenses. This law made the penalty for such a crime very severe. Upon conviction, the offender was to suffer death without benefit of clergy. North Carolina had already, 1779, enacted a law with the same penalty against stealing slaves and kidnapping free Negroes. The other Southern states which had laws against kidnapping are Alabama, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, Florida, South Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Georgia. Delaware, however, had the most interesting as well as very severe laws against kidnapping. That of 1793 required that anyone guilty of kidnapping or of assisting to kidnap free Negroes or mulattoes should be whipped with 39 lashes on the bare back and stand in the pillory with both of his ears nailed to it, and when he came out to have their soft parts cut off. In 1826 the penalties were made even more severe: $1,000 fine, pillory 1 hour, to be whipped with 60 lashes upon the bare back, to be imprisoned from 3 to 7 years, at the expiration of which he was to be disposed of as a servant for 7 years, and upon second conviction to suffer death. In 1831, Congress passed a law to prevent the abduction and sale of free Negroes from the District of Columbia. It is quite evident from these laws that kidnapping was a very common crime. It does not appear, however, that they prevented it. Even as early as 1817, it was estimated by Torrey, who seems to have made a study of the subject, that several thousand legally free persons were toiling in servitude, having been kidnapped. Free Negro children were the ones who were most liable to be kidnapped, for the reason probably that they were easier managed and less likely to have about them proofs of their freedom, though sometimes, indeed, even white children, whether being mistaken for Negroes or not, were stolen and sold into slavery. More than 20 free colored children were kidnapped in Philadelphia in 1825. It is stated that some persons gained a livelihood by stealing Negroes from the towns of the North and carrying them to the South for sale. Statements similar to the following are often to be met with in the papers published in slavery times. 4 Negro children, 1817, 9 and 5 years respectively, first 2 girls, last 2 boys, were kidnapped and carried off from Gallatin County, Illinois, on the evening of 5 ultimate. The father was tied while the children were taken away. The kidnapping gang is regularly organized and is increasing. The members are well known but cannot be punished on account of the disqualification of Negroes as witnesses. About midnight on the 27th of September, a party of 8 or 10 Kentuckians broke into the house of a Mr. Powell in Cass County, Michigan, while he was absent. They drew their pistols and bowie knives, and dragged his wife and 3 children from their beds, and bound them with cords, and hurried them off to their covered wagons, and started post-haste for Kentucky. Probably kidnapping was carried on even more extensively in the slave states themselves. The Liberator, quoting from the Denton Journal in 1849, says, 3 free Negro youths, a girl and 2 boys, were kidnapped and taken from the county with intent to sell them to the South. They had been hired for a few days by Mr. James T. Wooters, near Denton, for the ostensible purpose of cutting cornstalks. After being a day or 2 in Mr. Wooter's employ, they suddenly disappeared. Inquiry being set on foot, it was, after some days, discovered that they had been secretly carried through Hunting Creek towards Worcester County, thence to Virginia. We learn that the Negroes are now in Norfolk. They were carried to Richmond, where they were sold as slaves, but were finally recovered. Notwithstanding the harshness of the Delaware laws against kidnapping and the convictions under them, the business of kidnapping seems to have flourished there. A quotation or 2 will illustrate. 2 young colored men, free-born, were stolen from Wilmington a few nights ago, and taken, it is supposed, to some of the southern slave markets. 50 or 60 persons, it is said, have been stolen from the lower part of the state in the last 6 months. In 1840, the Baltimore Sun said, "A most villainous system of kidnapping has been extensively carried on in the State of Delaware by a gang of scoundrels residing there, aided and abetted by a number of Confederates living on the eastern shore of this State." While discussing kidnapping in Delaware, it is very unlikely we should forget to mention probably the most notorious kidnapping gang which the domestic slave trade produced. The principal character of the gang, and the one from which it seems to have drawn its inspiration, and the one from which it took its name, was a woman, in looks more like a man than a woman, Patty Cannon by name, well known by tradition to every Delawarean and eastern shore of Marylander. A son-in-law of hers was hanged for the murder of a negro trader. His widow then married one Joe Johnson, who became a noted character in the business of kidnapping through the aid and instruction of his mother-in-law, Patty Cannon. Johnson was convicted once and suffered the punishment of the lash and pillory. The grand jury in May 1829 found 3 indictments for murder against Patty Cannon, but she died in jail May 11 of the same year. White kidnappers sometimes used free colored men as tools by means of which to ensnare other free colored men, and shared with them the profits of the trade. Indeed, the free colored men seem not to have been much averse in aiding in the enslavement of their brethren. They sometimes even formed kidnapping bands of their own, and pursued the business without the aid of white men. Such a gang as this once operated near Snow Hill, Maryland. It is said to have kidnapped and sent off several hundred free Negroes. Kidnappers devised various schemes for the accomplishment of their purposes, some of them no less humorous than infamous. A man in Philadelphia was found to be engaged in the occupation of courting and marrying mulatto women, and then selling them as slaves. Another plan was for 1 or 2 Confederates to find out the bodily marks of a suitable free colored person, after which the other Confederate would go before a magistrate and lay claim to the ill-fated Negro, describing his marks, call in his accomplice as witness, and so get possession of the negroes. Probably the most ingenious of all methods of kidnapping was that brought to light in Charleston, South Carolina, as related by Francis Hall. The agents were a justice of the peace, a constable, and a slave dealer. A victim having been selected, one of the firm applied to the justice upon a shown charge of assault or similar offense, for a writ, which was immediately issued and served by the constable, and the negro conveyed to prison. The constable now appears, exaggerates the dangers of his situation, explains how small is his chance of being liberated, even if innocent, by reason of the amount of jail fees and other legal expenses, but he knows a worthy man who is interested in his behalf, and will do what is necessary to procure his freedom upon no harder condition than an agreement to serve him for a certain number of years. It may be supposed the negro is persuaded. The worthy slave dealer now appears on the stage, the indenture of bondage is ratified in the presence of the worthy magistrate and the constable, who shares the price of blood, and the victim is hurried on shipboard to be seen no more. From the nature of our information concerning kidnapping, it is readily seen that we have but little basis for a statistical estimate of the number kidnapped. It must have ranged, however, from a few hundred to 2,000 or 3,000 annually. It appears quite certain that as many were kidnapped as escaped from bondage, if not more. The Liberator alone records nearly 100 cases of detected kidnapping between 1831 and 1860, but the number detected probably bears but little relation to the number actually kidnapped. As was before shown in the cases mentioned, almost whole families were carried off, and that, in most cases, when a discovery was made, it was found that the kidnapping gang had been in the business for years. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Slave Prisons, Markets, Character of Traders, etc. In all the large towns and cities were slave prisons or pens, in which slaves were kept until enough for a drove or shipment could be collected. The slave prisons ranged all the way from a rude whitewashed shed to large and commodious establishment accommodating hundreds of slaves. A description of one of these, the Franklin and Armfield prison, which was in Alexandria, by Andrews, is rather interesting. The establishment, he says, is situated in a retired quarter in the southern part of the city. It is easily distinguished as you approach it by the high whitewashed wall surrounding the yards, and giving to it the appearance of a penitentiary. The dwelling house is of brick, 3 stories high, opening directly upon the street. Over the front door is the name of the firm. We passed out of the back door of the dwelling house and entered a spacious yard, nearly surrounded with neatly whitewashed 2-story buildings devoted to the use of the slaves. Turning to the left, we came to a strong grated door of iron opening into a spacious yard, surrounded by a high whitewashed wall. One side of this yard was roofed, but the principal part was open to the air. Along the covered side extended a table at which the slaves had recently taken their dinner, which, judging from what remained, had been wholesome and abundant. The gate was secured by strong padlocks and bolts. Such was the slave prison of one of the largest and most prosperous slave-dealing firms. There were many dealers who had no place of their own in which to keep slaves, but were dependent upon the prisons of others. Indeed, at Washington, the city public prison was often used by Negro traders as a place of safety for their slaves. The keeper was paid by the traders for the privilege. This practice continued a great number of years. In 1843, the poet Whittier thus describes the prison: "It is a damp, dark, and loathsome building. We pass between 2 ranges of small stone cells filled with blacks. We noticed 5 or 6 in a single cell, which seemed scarcely large enough for a solitary tenant. The heat was suffocating. In rainy weather, the keeper told us that the prison was uncomfortably wet. In winter, there could be no fire in these cells. The keeper, with some reluctance, admitted that he received Negroes from the traders, and kept them until they were sold at 34 cents per day." While no doubt some traders kept their prisons in as good condition as circumstances would allow, there were others, and probably the majority, who did not. A Northern minister describes those at Richmond in 1845 as mostly filthy and loathsome places. In the buying states, 2 of the principal slave markets were Natchez and New Orleans. That of Natchez is thus described about 1835 by Ingram: "A mile from Natchez we come to a cluster of rough wooden buildings in the angle of 2 roads, in front of which several saddle horses, either tied or held by servants, indicated a place of popular resort. We entered through a wide gate into a narrow courtyard. A line of Negroes extended in a semicircle around the right side of the yard. There were in all about 40. Each was dressed in the usual uniform when in market, consisting of a fashionably shaped black fur hat, trousers of coarse corduroy velvet, good vests, strong shoes, and white cotton shirts. There are 4 or 5 markets in the vicinity of Natchez. Several hundred slaves of all ages are exposed to sale. 2 extensive markets for slaves opposite each other on the road to Washington 3 miles from Natchez." A slave market in New Orleans was described in 1844 as a large and splendidly decorated edifice, which had the appearance of having been fitted up as a place of recreation. It had a number of apartments, a handsome archway, and a large green lawn or outer court, beautifully decorated with trees. In this lawn the sale of slaves was held. When a trader in the selling states had collected enough for a shipment or coffle, they were sent to the markets in the buying states. Slaves were sent south both by land and water. In the winter they were usually sent by water, but in summer they were often sent by land. In the transportation of slaves, the utmost precautions were necessary to prevent revolt or escape. When a coffle, or drove, was formed to undertake its march of 7 or 8 weeks to the south, the men would be chained, 2 by 2, and a chain passing through the double file, and fastening from the right and left hands of those on either side of the chain. This seems to have been the usual method of securing them. The purpose was to have the men so completely bound as to render escape or resistance impossible. The girls, children, and women usually were not chained, and even sometimes rode in the wagons which accompanied the train. The droves were conducted by white men, usually on horseback, and well armed with pistols and whips. The Negroes were usually well fed on their way south, and when they arrived at their destination, though their personal appearance was not improved, they were generally stouter and in better condition than when they began their march. Pains were now taken to have them polish their skins and dress themselves in the uniform suits provided for the purpose. Then they were ready for market. At the sale, the auctioneer would descant at large upon the merits and capabilities of the subject. The slave, too, often would enter into a display of his physical appearance, with as much apparent earnestness to command a high price as though he were to share the profits. He would seem to enjoy a spirited bidding. Each Negro wished to be sold first, as it was thought by them to be an evidence of superiority. At the sales and auctions, the purchaser was allowed the greatest freedom in the examination of the slaves for sale, and he would scrutinize them as carefully as though they were horses or cattle. The teeth, eyes, feet, and shoulders of both men and women were inspected, sometimes without any show of decency. Scars or marks of the lash decreased their value in market. Sometimes the sale would be lost for that reason. In the slave trade there is no doubt that families were often separated. Though Andrews tells of a trader sending a lot of mothers without their children in such a way as to lead one to believe such a case was exceptional. Negroes on large plantations were sometimes advertised to be sold in families. Nehemiah Adams says that in settling estates in the South, good men exercise as much care with regard to the disposition of slaves as though they were providing for white orphan children. Slaves are allowed to find masters and mistresses who will buy them. Another traveler, in speaking of the slave auction at Natchez, says, "It is a rule seldom deviated from to sell families and relations together, if practicable. A Negro trader in my presence refused to sell a Negro girl for whom a planter offered a high price because he would not also purchase her sister." As a rule, Negroes had a great dislike to be sold South. In the early history of the trade, this amounted to horror for them. Whether this dislike arose from the impression that they might not be treated so well, or simply from the natural dislike of removing to a strange land, is a question, though the latter seems much more probable. In 1835, however, it appears that the Virginia slaves were not so averse to going South for the reason that many who had gone there sent back such favorable accounts of their circumstances. Another phase of the domestic slave trade, which it may not be out of way to mention, was the traffic in beautiful mulatto or quadroon girls. It was a part of the slave trader's business to search out and obtain them. In New Orleans or elsewhere they were sold at very high prices for the purposes of prostitution or as mistresses. From a letter written in 1850 by a slave dealer of Alexandria, Virginia, we quote the following: "We cannot afford to sell the girl Emily for less than $1,800. We have 2 or 3 offers for Emily from gentlemen from the South. She is said to be the finest looking woman in this country." In New Orleans they often brought very high prices. The Liberator, quoting from the New York Sun in 1837 concerning the sale of a girl at New Orleans, says, "The beautiful Martha was struck off at $4,500. And in the New Orleans Picayune of the same year was an account of a girl, remarkable for her beauty and intelligence, who sold at $7,000 in New Orleans. Many other instances might be given, but we think these sufficient. A word now with reference to slave traders and the general estimation in which they were held in the South. Ingram says their admission into society is not recognized. Planters associate with them freely enough in the way of business, but notice them no further. A slave trader is much like other men. He is today a plain farmer with 20 or 30 slaves endeavoring to earn a few dollars from the worn-out land in some old homestead. He is in debt, and hears he can sell his slaves in Mississippi for twice their value in his own state. He takes his slaves and goes to Mississippi. He finds it profitable, and his inclinations prompt him to buy of his neighbors when he returns home, and makes another trip to Mississippi. Thus he gets started. Some traders were no doubt honorable men. Indeed, Andrews gives us a very pleasing picture of Armfield, the noted Alexandria, Virginia, slave dealer. He describes him as a man of fine personal appearance and of engaging and graceful manners. Nothing, however, can reconcile the moral sense of the Southern public to the character of a trader in slaves. However honorable may be his dealings, his employment is accounted infamous. Upon the whole, no doubt, the characterization of the slave traders by Featherstone was a true one. Sordid, illiterate, and vulgar, men who have nothing whatever in common with the gentlemen of the Southern States. Finch says, "A slave trader is considered the lowest and most degraded occupation, and none will engage in it unless they have no other means of support." Indeed, it seems they were accounted the abhorrence of everyone. Their descendants, when known, had a blot upon them, and the property acquired in the traffic as well. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Laws of the Southern States with reference to importation and exportation of slaves. Virginia. The General Assembly of Virginia, 1778, enacted that no slave shall hereafter be imported into this Commonwealth by sea or land, nor shall any slave or slave so imported be sold or bought by any person whatever, under penalty of £1,000 for every slave imported, and £500 for every one either sold or bought, and the slave himself to be free. It was provided, however, that persons removing to the state from other states with the intention of becoming citizens of Virginia might bring their slaves with them, upon taking the following oath within 10 days of their arrival. I, A.B., do swear that my removal to the state of Virginia was with no intention to evade the act for preventing the further importation of slaves within this Commonwealth, nor have I brought with me, nor have any of the slaves now in my possession been imported from Africa, or any of the West India Islands, since the 1st day of November, 1778, so help me God. This act did not apply to persons claiming slaves by descent, marriage, or divorce, or to any citizen of Virginia who was then the actual owner of slaves within any of the United States, nor to transient travelers having slaves as necessary attendants. In 1785, a law was passed declaring free the slaves who should afterward be imported and kept in the state a year, whether at one time or at several times. The same exceptions were made as the law of 1778. In 1796, these acts were amended, making it lawful for any citizen of the United States residing in Virginia or owning lands there to carry out any slaves born in the state and bring them back, provided they had neither been hired nor sold. If, however, they were entitled to freedom in the state to which they were removed, they could not again be held as slaves in Virginia. In 1806, a law was passed totally prohibiting the introduction of slaves into Virginia. It was amended, however, in 1811 in favor of residents of the state, as it restored to them the same privileges concerning the importation of slaves which they had under the law of 1778. An act of January 9, 1813, further amended and extended to immigrants the right of bringing in slaves. They were allowed to introduce only such slaves as they had owned for 2 years or acquired by marriage or inheritance. Anyone introducing slaves was put under obligation not to sell them within 2 years. Those thus importing slaves were required also to exhibit before a justice of the peace a written statement with the name, age, sex, and description of each slave, and to take oath that the account was true, and that they were not introduced for the purpose of sale or with the intention of evading the laws. The last act of Virginia regarding the importation of slaves was that of 1819. This law permitted the importation of slaves not convicted of crime from any of the United States. South Carolina. In 1792, South Carolina passed a law to prohibit for 2 years the importation of slaves from Africa, or from other places beyond the seas. It also prohibited the introduction of slaves who were bound for a term of years in any of the United States. An exception, however, was made of citizens who might acquire slaves by marriage, or actual settlers in the state, and of travelers. This act was revised in 1794 and extended to 1797. As revised, it totally prohibited the introduction of slaves into South Carolina from all places from without the United States. In 1796, it was extended to 1799. Again extended in 1798 to 1801 (a), and in 1800 it was again extended to 1803. In 1800, also, an act was passed totally prohibiting the introduction of slaves into the state except by immigrants, and in 1801 it was made even more stringent. Any slaves brought in were to be sold by the sheriff of the district in which they were found upon the order of the court. It was found that the acts of 1800 and 1801 were too rigorous and inconvenient. In 1802, that part of the laws which prevented citizens of other states from carrying their own slaves through South Carolina was repealed. It was provided that anyone who wished to pass through the state with slaves might do so, but near the place where he was to enter the state he should take the following oath before a magistrate or quorum. I, A.B., do swear that the slaves which I am carrying through this state are bona fide my property, and that I will not sell, hire, or dispose of said slaves, or either of them, to any resident or citizen, or body corporate or public, or any other person or persons whomsoever within the state of South Carolina, but will travel directly to the place where I intend to move. In 1803, an act repealing and amending former acts on the importation of slaves was enacted. The introduction of Negroes from the West Indies or South America was prohibited, and from any of the other states unless with a certificate of good character. There was no restriction with respect to Africa. No more laws regarding importation were passed until 1816. Then it was enacted that no slaves should be brought into the state from any of the United States or territories or countries bordering thereon. The only exception was in favor of travelers with not more than 2 slaves, or settlers on their way to other states, who, before entering South Carolina, were required to take an oath with regard to their slaves, similar to that required by the law of 1802. This law was amended in 1817, in part, as follows: that every inhabitant of this state who was bona fide entitled in his or her own right, or in the right of his wife, to any slave or slaves on the 19th of December, 1816, or hereafter, shall become entitled to any such slave by inheritance or marriage, shall be permitted to bring them in on certain conditions. Both the law of 1816 and that of 1817 were repealed in 1818. In 1823, South Carolina made it lawful to bring into the state any slave from the West Indies, South America, or from Europe, or from any sister state which may be situated to the north of the Potomac River or the city of Washington. No slave was allowed to return to South Carolina who had been carried out of the state and had visited any of these places. The penalty was severe, it being $1,000 and forfeiture of the slave. This law was reenacted in 1835, and in 1847 it was amended to allow slaves to return who could go to Cuba on board of any steamboat in the capacity of steward, cook, fireman, engineer, pilot, or mariner, provided he had visited none of the other restricted places. It was amended again in 1848, and Baltimore and all ports on the Chesapeake Bay in the state of Maryland were placed on the same footing with regard to the importation of slaves as the states south of the Potomac. North Carolina. In 1786, North Carolina passed her first law to restrict the importation of slaves from other states. It was as follows: Every person who shall introduce into this state any slave from any of the United States, which have passed laws for the liberation of slaves, shall, on complaint thereof before any justice of the peace, be compelled by such justice to enter into bond with sufficient surety, in the sum of $100 current money for each slave, for the removing of such slave to the state from whence such slave was brought, within 3 months thereafter, the penalty to be recovered, one half for the use of the state, the other half for the use of the prosecutor, or a failure of a compliance therewith. And the person introducing such slave shall also, in case of such failure, forfeit and pay the sum of $200 to be recovered by any person suing for the same and applied to their use. The law of 1794 prohibited the introduction of slaves and indentured servants of color. Exceptions were made of slave owners coming to the States to reside, and of citizens of North Carolina inheriting slaves in other states. In 1795, immigrants from the West Indies, Bahama Islands, French, Dutch, and Spanish settlements on the southern coast of America were prevented from bringing in slaves who were more than 15 years of age. An act of 1776, however, allowed slaves to be brought in who belonged to residents near the Virginia and South Carolina boundaries. A law was passed in 1816 which provided that slaves brought into North Carolina from foreign countries, contrary to the Act of Congress of 1807, to be sold. No more laws concerning importation were passed after the repeal of the laws against importation about 1818. Georgia. Georgia passed a law against the importation of slaves in 1793. This seemed to apply only to slaves imported from without the United States. In 1798, a new constitution was framed, which provided that there shall be no importation of slaves into this state from Africa or any foreign place after the 1st of October next. In 1817, the following was enacted: It shall not be lawful, except in cases herein authorized and allowed, for any person or persons whatever to bring, import, or introduce into this state, to aid or assist or knowingly to become concerned or interested in bringing, importing, or introducing into this state, either by land or by water or in any manner whatsoever, any slave or slaves. Citizens of Georgia and those of other states coming to Georgia to live were permitted to bring in slaves for their own use. Before importing them, they were required to make oath before the proper authorities that they were not imported for sale or hire, lend, or mortgage. The act was not to extend to travelers. This act was repealed in 1824, and slaves then were imported and disposed of without restriction. The law of 1817 was revised in 1829, modified in 1836, again repealed in 1841, revived again in 1842. In 1835, a law was enacted making anyone subject to fine and imprisonment who should bring into Georgia any male slave who had been to a non-slaveholding state or to any foreign country. In 1849, all laws and parts of laws, civil and criminal, forbidding or in any manner restricting the importation of slaves into this state from any other slaveholding state were repealed. Cities and towns were given the right to regulate the sale of slaves by traders and to prescribe the places in their jurisdiction where slaves might be kept and sold. In 1852, so much of this law as had reference to importation of slaves was repealed, and the Act of 1817 was revived. But the penitentiary imprisonment clause was eliminated. The law of 1852 was repealed by the legislature of 1855-6, and the Act of 1849 was revived, thus again opening the state to the unrestricted importation of slaves. Maryland. In 1783, Maryland prohibited the importation of slaves. It was amended in 1791 and also in 1794. In 1796, the General Assembly of Maryland enacted that it shall not be lawful from and after the passing of this act to import or bring into this state by land or water any negro, mulatto, or other slave for sale or to reside within this state, and any person brought into this state as a slave contrary to this act, if a slave before, shall thereupon immediately cease to be the property of the person or persons so importing or bringing such slave within the state, and shall be free. Immigrants to the state were allowed to bring in their own slaves at the time of removal or within 1 year afterward. It was required that these slaves should have been within the United States 3 years. In 1797, this law was modified in favor of those coming into Maryland to reside. In 1810, a law was passed to prevent those who were slaves for a limited time from being sold out of state. In 1817, a law was passed regulating the exportation of slaves as follows: that whenever any person shall purchase any slave or slaves within this state for the purpose of exporting or removing the same beyond the limits of this state, it shall be their duty to take from the seller a bill of sale for said slave or slaves, in which the age and distinguishing marks, as nearly as may be, and the name of such slave or slaves shall be inserted, and the same shall be acknowledged before some justice of the peace of the county where the sale shall be made, and lodged to be recorded in the office of the clerk of the said county within 20 days, and the clerk shall immediately on the receipt thereof actually record the same, and deliver a copy thereof on demand to the purchaser, with a certificate endorsed thereupon under the seal of the county of the same being duly recorded. The following year, 1818, a law was passed which provided that any slave convicted of a crime, which in the judgment of the court should not be punished by hanging, might be transported for sale. In 1846, the legislature enacted that slaves sentenced to the penitentiary should be publicly sold at the expiration of their service and transported. In 1831, a very restrictive law was enacted. It prohibited the introduction of slaves into the state either for sale or residence. The restrictive policy did not continue long, for in 1833 the barrier to the introduction of slaves for residence was withdrawn. Persons removing to the state with the intention of becoming citizens were required to pay a tax on every slave introduced for the benefit of the state colonization society. This act was supplemented by another in 1839. Immigrants were required to make affidavit that it was their intention to become citizens of the state and to pay a tax on their slaves imported from $5 to $15, according to age. In 1847, a provision was made to allow guardians, executors, and trustees residing in the state to bring in slaves appointed by a last will. In 1850, all laws against the importation of life slaves was repealed, except such as extended to those who were slaves for a term of years, or those convicted of crime in another state. Maryland continued open to the introduction of slaves. Delaware. Delaware has the distinction of being the only one of the original Southern states to embody a declaration unfavorable to the importation of slaves in her first Constitution. In that of 1776, she says, "No person hereafter imported into this state from Africa ought to be held in slavery under any pretense whatever, and no Negro, Indian, or mulatto ought to be brought into this state for sale from any part of the world." In 1787, a law was passed regulating the exportation of slaves. A permit was required to export Negroes. A law permitting the introduction of slaves who were devised or inherited was enacted. The law against exportation was made more severe. In 1793, another law was enacted to further regulate the exportation of slaves. It only made a slight change. Any Negro exported, contrary to the act, was to have his freedom. In 1828, courts were given the right to sentence slaves for certain offenses to be exported. Thus, those exported were not allowed to return to the state. There were reenactments in 1827 and 1829 concerning the exportation of slaves. In 1833, a law was passed to enable farmers to carry slaves into Maryland to cultivate land without incurring any penalty. There seems to have been no more enactments of Delaware concerning importation or exportation of slaves. Louisiana. The Act of Congress in 1804, erecting Louisiana into a territory, prohibited the introduction of slaves into it from without the United States. Only slaves imported before May 1, 1798, could be introduced, and those had to be slaves of actual settlers. An act of Louisiana in 1810 was to prevent the introducing of slaves who had been guilty of crime. It was not until 1826 that Louisiana as a state passed any law against the introduction of slaves as merchandise. But this year it was enacted that no person or persons shall, after the 1st day of June, 1826, bring into this state any slave or slaves with the intention to sell or hire the same. Citizens of Louisiana and immigrants could bring in their own slaves, but were not allowed to hire, exchange, or sell them within 2 years after such importation. This act was repealed in 1828, but in 1829 another law was passed, which required that any one who should introduce slaves above 12 years of age to have a certificate for each slave, signed by 2 respectable and well-known freeholders of the county from which the slaves were brought, accompanied with their declaration on oath that the slaves had never been guilty of crime, and that they were of good character. Children under 10 years of age could not be brought in separate from their mother. This was repealed March 24, 1831. Almost immediately after the Southampton massacre in Virginia, Louisiana called an extra session of her legislature. The only important act of the session was an act prohibiting importation of slaves for sale or hire. Immigrants and citizens were prohibited from bringing in slaves from Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Arkansas. Those permitted to be brought in could not be sold or hired within 5 years. A certificate, as in the law of 1829, was also required. It was amended during the same session, and the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri were included in the prohibition. It was repealed in 1834, and no other law with respect to the importation of slaves was ever enacted by Louisiana. Mississippi. The Act of Congress in 1798 establishing a government in the Mississippi Territory prohibited the importation of slaves from without the United States, and the Constitution of 1817 excluded slaves guilty of high crimes in other states. The Territorial Act of 1808 made it unlawful to expose for sale any slave above 15 years of age without having previously exhibited to the Chief Justice of the Orphans' Court of the county where offered for sale a certificate signed by 2 respectable freeholders living in the county from whence the slave was brought, describing the stature, complexion, sex, name, and not to have been guilty of any murder, crime, arson, burglary, felony, larceny, to their knowledge or belief where he came from, which certificate shall be signed and acknowledged before the clerk of the county from whence he came, and certification by said clerk that those whose names are prefixed are respectable freeholders. Such certificates aforesaid shall be registered with the register of the Orphans' Court where such slaves are sold, the seller taking oath that he believes said certificate is just and true. In 1819 another act was passed to amend the law of 1808. Slaves brought into the state as merchandise were made subject to a tax of $20 each. A certificate was required as in the law of 1808, but it was not to apply to those brought in for their own use by citizens and immigrants, except those from Louisiana and the Alabama Territory. An act of 1822 reduced into one the several acts concerning slaves, free Negroes, and mulattoes, but no important changes were made with regard to the importation of slaves. The new Constitution of 1832, like that of 1817, excluded slaves guilty of high crimes in other states. It declared also that the introduction of slaves into this state as merchandise or for sale shall be prohibited from and after the 1st day of May, 1833. This provision of the Constitution gave rise to a great deal of litigation, nor was it effective in prohibiting importation of slaves. The latter appears from the fact that in 1837, by an act of the legislature, the business of introducing or importing slaves into this state as merchandise or for sale be and the same time is hereby prohibited. The penalty was $500 and 6 months' imprisonment for each slave so brought in, and notes which might be given for slaves were not collectible. The law was repealed in 1846. Alabama. The first law passed by Alabama concerning the importation of slaves was for the purpose of carrying into effect the laws of the United States prohibiting the slave trade. This was enacted in 1823 and provided that slaves imported should be employed on public works or sold for the state. But on January 13, 1827, it was enacted that if any person or persons shall bring into this state any slave or slaves for the purpose of sale or hire, or shall sell or hire any slave or slaves brought into this state after the 1st day of August next, such person or persons shall forfeit and pay the sum of $1,000 for each Negro so brought in, one half thereof to the person suing for the same, and the other half to the use of the state. And, moreover, any person thus offending shall be subject to indictment, and, on conviction, shall be liable to be fined a sum not exceeding $500 for each offense, and shall be imprisoned not exceeding 3 months, at the discretion of the jury trying such offense. Citizens of the state, however, were allowed to purchase Negroes for their own use, but could not sell them until 2 years after being brought into the state. This law was repealed in 1829. Another prohibitive law was passed January 16, 1832, but immigrants were allowed to bring their own slaves with them, and citizens of the state could import slaves for their own use when these introduced slaves' returns were to be made upon oath to the county courts within 30 days, describing them and declaring that they were not introduced for the purpose of sale or hire. Citizens of Alabama could import slaves which might have become theirs by inheritance or marriage. The provisions of the law did not apply to travelers, nor to citizens temporarily removed from the state. This was repealed December 4, 1832, and no other prohibitive law was enacted. Kentucky. The laws passed by Virginia concerning importation of slaves prior to 1790 were in force in Kentucky until 1798. This year, an act reducing into one several acts concerning slaves, free Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians was passed. No slaves could be imported into Kentucky who were introduced into the United States from foreign countries, except by immigrants who did not violate this provision. Citizens could do the same, but no slaves might be imported as merchandise. An act amending this was approved February 8, 1815. No one was allowed to bring slaves into Kentucky except those intending to settle in the state, and they were required to take the following oath: I, A.B., do swear or affirm that my removal to the state of Kentucky was with an intention to become a citizen thereof, and that I have brought with me no slave or slaves, and will bring no slave or slaves to this state with the intention of selling them. In 1833 it was enacted that each and every person who shall hereafter import into this state any slave or slaves, or shall sell or buy or contract for the sale or purchase for a longer term than 1 year of the service of any such slave or slaves, knowing the same to have been imported as aforesaid, he, she, or they so offending shall forfeit $600 for each slave so imported, sold, or bought, or whose service has been so contracted for. It was not to apply to immigrants, provided they took the required oath, nor to citizens of Kentucky who derived their title by will, descent, distribution, marriage, gift, or in consideration of marriage, nor to travelers who could prove to the satisfaction of a jury that the slaves were for necessary attendants. There were minor acts and quite a number of acts of a private character. Tennessee. Tennessee was originally a part of North Carolina, and the laws of North Carolina, which were in force at the time of the cession of Tennessee to the United States in 1790, were continued in force in Tennessee. The first law passed by Tennessee with reference to importation of slaves was in 1812. It prohibited their importation as merchandise for a term of 5 years. Persons coming as settlers or residents who had acquired slaves by descent, devise, marriage, or purchase for their own use were permitted to import them. Immigrants were obliged to take the following oath: I, A.B., do solemnly swear or affirm that I have removed myself and slaves to the state of Tennessee with the full and sole view of becoming a citizen, and that I have not brought my slave or slaves to this state with any view to the securing of the same against any rebellion or apprehension of rebellion, so help me God. No other law concerning importation was enacted until 1826. It was practically the same as that of 1812, except that it was a perpetual act, and no one was allowed to introduce slaves which had been guilty of crimes in other states. This act continued in force until 1855, when so much of it was repealed as related to the importation of slaves as merchandise. Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, and Texas. The Constitution of Missouri, 1820, circumscribed the powers of the legislature with reference to importation of slaves as follows: The General Assembly shall have no power to pass laws to prevent bona fide immigrants to this state, or actual settlers therein, from bringing from any of the United States or from any of their territories such persons as may be deemed to be slaves, so long as any person of the same description are allowed to be held as slaves by the laws of this state. They shall have power to pass laws: to prohibit the introduction into this state of any slaves who may have committed any high crime in any other state or territory; to prohibit the introduction of any slave for the purpose of speculation, or as an article of trade or merchandise; to prohibit the introduction of any slave or the offspring of any slave, who heretofore may have been, or who hereafter may be imported from any foreign country into the United States, or any territory thereof, in contravention of any existing statute of the United States. The first constitutions of most of the other Southern states had provisions somewhat similar to these, among which are Arkansas, Florida, and Texas. The only laws passed by Missouri regarding importation were those of 1835, 1843, and 1845. The law of 1843 simply prohibited the importation of slaves entitled to freedom at a future date, and against kidnapping in 1845. The law of 1835 was the leading one. It prohibited the introduction of any slave who had elsewhere committed any infamous crime, or any who had been removed from Missouri for crime, or any imported into the United States contrary to law. Texas and Florida, as states, seem never to have prohibited the importation of slaves, except those guilty of crime. The only act of Arkansas concerning importation was passed in 1838 and put in force by proclamation of the governor, March 20, 1839. It was never repealed, so far as we could find, and is as follows: No person shall knowingly bring or cause to be brought into this state, or hold, purchase, hire, sell, or otherwise dispose of within the same, first, any slave who may have committed in any other state, territory, or district within the United States, or any foreign country, any offense which, if committed within the state, would, according to the laws thereof, be felony or infamous crime. Or second, any slave who shall have been convicted in this state of any felony or infamous crime, and ordered to be taken or removed out of this state, according to the laws thereof. Or third, any slave who shall have actually been removed out of this state after a conviction of felony or other infamous crime, although no order of removal shall have been made. Or fourth, any person or the descendant of any person who shall have been imported into the United States or any of the territories thereof in contravention of the laws of the United States and held as a slave. End of chapter 7. End of The Domestic Slave Trade of the Southern States by Winfield H. Collins.